Well, it's a very interesting chapter of Revelation that I'm quite enjoying preparing for and sharing with you today. Revelation's been always a fairly mysterious book. Some of you have had people knock on your door at times and say, you know, the exact number from the book of Revelation of how many people will be saved. And then when you tell them, well, there's more than 160-some thousand people in the world, and there's always a way of describing, well, certainly, you know, that really means so many elders, and there's always a way around the numbers in the Bible. Martin Luther, the reformer, he actually thought Revelation, the book, was so controversial that he questioned whether it should even be in the Bible because of how people can take this book of Revelation and scare people, even direct violence towards people. And that's exactly what Diane Butler lifts up in her chapter here, that sometimes this book has been used as escapism from the world, as if God is preparing to destroy this world, and as if you don't get right with God, that God's coming, and you better look out. So what she helps us do is, she says, this book is not an escape. In fact, the end of history, she argues, is not destruction. It says in the scriptures of Revelation, sin and evil, they will pass away as the city of God comes to us. Water, trees, and sparkling city where God makes all things new. I love that. God makes all things new. This revelation is a revelation of imagination, of vision. Diane Butler Bassett should say, says, the Bible begins in the garden, it ends with a divine holy city. And the sacred city gathers all humanity and even nature together in a very intimate relationship with God. This new heaven and earth is diverse. Everyone is gathered together in love and friendship. God's the host. And the only requirement of this new heaven is you want to be there. You want to be there. So, shifting just a little bit from Diane's perspective, I'm a last minute kind of guy, so I really like Eugene Peterson, and my friend gave this to me just before church today. It's a whole book on Revelation, and I think you can always look at the first chapter and the last chapter of a book quickly, and anyway, in his last lines of his book, Eugene Peterson captures for me what Revelation means. He says, "Come, Lord Jesus," is often the Aramaic original for Maranatha, a basic Christian prayer. Eugene says, as Christ comes to us, there's always an element of surprise that will cause us to cry out in delight. So that is what it is meant. Eugene is saying, we don't need to be anxious about the future. We need to be expectant. Come, Lord Jesus, and ready to be surprised. In sabbatical time, traveling across the country, I was able to worship in different locations, and it was interesting to go in as a visitor and to sit in a church and to be very aware of that this, I would call it a divine presence of God just in people gathering together. And this is my interpretation, because we all know that today people's lives are so busy. Who's got time for church? Who's got time for worship? But when I gathered, wherever I was across the country, there was the sense that people were expecting something, that they were gathering to ponder either purpose in life, their meaning in life, where was God at work in their life. And that for me is revelation. When I was a young man wondering about becoming a teacher or about ministry, little did I know that when a gentleman in his late 80s, John, would say to me one day, I don't know very much about church, because I never went to church, but if there's one thing I know, And I was just the gardener at the nursing home. He happened to become friends with me, but he looked at me and he said, if there's one thing I know, he said, John, his name was John too, John, I think you would make a really good minister. So I'm scratching my head going, well, he didn't go to church. He doesn't know much about church, but he thinks I'd make a good minister. But little did I know, as much as I know now. I mean, I knew that he had a drinking issue. I mean, he called it his apple juice, but every day he had his fishing hat on, just like Golden Pond, and he had his little shot of it was apple juice. But, you know, when we really got to a deeper friendship, he had battled drinking alcohol his whole life. And he had wished life had been different for his children and for his own life, his wife and him. There were good things about his life, but there were painful things. But little did he know that some words that he would express to me would live on in my life in a very revelational way. God came to me through somebody that was very weak and vulnerable, but God came to me with a revelation. Diane Butler Bass speaks about 3 conversions. And in her conversion stories of life, she talks about leaving her childhood faith in some ways in her teens, and she followed a very evangelical Protestant church, and she was born again. She found Christ, and it was a very beautiful journey for her as Christ came into her life in a very transformative way. But she had 2 other conversions. And then later, as she grew in her life, she speaks about a conversion into, it happened to be the Episcopalian or the Anglican church. And in that conversion, she speaks about discovering liberalism and inclusiveness and how God was gradually, at one point, God had been really, she describes it a bit like the elevator. God up here, we're down here, and the job is to get closer to God by going up the elevator. And what Diane is trying to say, I think, about her 3rd conversion is that there's a spiritual movement in the world today, very alive, that is throwing up in the air this whole image of God up in a big chair in the clouds somewhere, some elevator taking you up to some transcendent God. But instead, a God that is very much with us, a God who is extremely embracive and accepting of diversity and the varied paths of life. And so she describes her 3rd conversion after 9/11, where for her as an American, she felt that the church just seemed to sadly turn really inward, back to a really traditional image of faith, where it was us against them. And so this new faith is one that opens her up to the revelation of a God that keeps surprising her in beautiful ways. Tony McKellier, he shares a very profound story. It was this past Monday in the Globe and Mail. So Tony says this. Tony says, I was once a white supremacist. Today, he is the executive director of Life After Hate.org. He dedicates his life to helping people leave far-right extremism. His experience and research has shown him that young people, including himself, are drawn to extremist groups, he believes, for a sense of identity. In other words, when one feels really unlovable, deep maybe in their subconscious, one might even feel deeply helpless or powerless, they're often drawn, not always, but it can be drawn, to dehumanize another group or another person. And this often happens in groups. Tony's very clear in this article in the Globe. He's not blaming his childhood. He's not trying to blame his parents. He takes sole responsibility for choosing to be a white supremacist in his past. But he says what he grew in discovering, the revelation to him, was that he just didn't love himself. So how could he love anybody else? In fact, by judging people of other races, or some people judge Jewish people, or judge whoever, it was a way of trying to find some way of being better than others because he hated himself so much. If shame and loneliness are a key part of our choice to hate another race, in his article he says, what's the answer? And Tony makes it abundantly clear. Heather read for it today in our scriptures. The answer is compassion. Ironically, as he was hating other groups of people, Jewish people, black people, it was actually a mentor in his life who came to him. The mentor happened to be a Jewish man. And he said, unbelievably, talk about a revelation, as he was hating Jews, a Jewish man showed him compassion. He says, one of the hardest things to do in this world is to show compassion for someone who's not compassionate for you. But these are the kind of people we need the most. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding even a deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out darkness. It's only love that can do that. My story of a young man and having John express love for me and affirmation of what he felt I was called to do. I knew deep in my heart of hearts, John really struggled to love himself, especially with his alcoholism. It was deeply rooted in that wrestle in his life. But even a revelation must have come to him. That something in his soul said to him, this young man seems to be somebody I think is needed in a church that he didn't even really know much about. And so his love for me is an incredible gift that I cherish always. So I want you to think again about revelation in your life. I'm sure there's more than one, but think about an experience in your life where you've been revealed a love for yourself that maybe you never even thought was possible. A revelation that's come to you that changed you. Or perhaps you're waiting for that. Perhaps you're waiting like Eugene Peterson. Come, Lord Jesus, come and surprise me. Surprise us all. Thanks be to God.